Impressions from the Laws of Thought, Tom Griffiths. So I want to talk a little bit about some ideas. I'm still just not even half through the book, but it's an interesting book. It's a book about thought, and it's a book about the idea of intelligence, at least from a human perspective. But there's certainly an overlap into artificial intelligence here, and I'm going to say why that's different. But let's talk about this particular takeaway I want to focus on right now. Here's the idea. So there's a concept of sort of an overlord of sensors, which is vision. So the idea of multimodality, and this is actually from an interview with Jeff Dean from Google. So you have vision, and by the way, he didn't say that, but that was my interpretation. The interview is from Latent Space podcast. Shout out to the Latent Space podcast. So we have multimodality. We have models that train from, the text and video and vision and all that stuff. And I guess there's a certain idea or a certain concept which leads us to believe that maybe vision is the king of all. And now I want to tie this to the book, The Laws of Thought. And I think there's something about it. And of course, this is also tied to Tesla and its only vision approach towards robotics, which I think is kind of fits nicely into this concept. So the idea is the following, that Tom Griffiths talks about the psychological distance. So in other words, there's a concept of colors, for example, where we have the ability to memorize certain colors better than others. And Amos Tversky takes this to the next level and says, well, there is some sort of psychological, it's almost like Euclidean geometry tells us that Chicago is closer to New York than San Francisco is to New York, right? So we can say that based on Euclidean geometry. And there's psychological distance, which can say that a circle is similar to an ellipse. But what Amos Tversky then discovered through his work is that people in their minds think that a circle is similar to an ellipse, but rarely think that an ellipse is similar to a circle. And that brought up the idea of directionality. So now we have the problem of, on the one hand, this distance, psychological distance, seems to be a thing, but then it's directional, or it doesn't commute to use physics, right? It goes one way, but not the other. And the idea being, and this is an interpretation that I kind of gathered, maybe it's going to come in the book. Like I said, I'm only like not even half through the book, so maybe Tom's going to talk about it. Apologize for that, but my interpretation is that there are these Platonic fundamental descriptions of reality, and then things that are close to it, and the circle is one of them. And this is obviously very Euclidean in that sense, or Greek, right? They thought about this. There's the fundamental shapes and things, and I want to use all this to elaborate a little bit on AI, and particularly Tesla's full self-driving technology, which is obviously only vision based, and I guess the idea being the following here. If you have vision, then you are, on the one hand, forced, or the other hand, you have the ability to interpret what you see. And this interpretation matters because of all the things that were discussed just right now. So we have the psychological distance, we have fundamental shapes like circles, and then we have ellipse, which is a derivative, and our intelligence is able to capture those types of relationships. And I think this leads me to the point that Tesla's only vision approach, it's much, much more than just a cost-saving measure. It really forces the AI to actually do these things, to interpret shapes, to think about what it's seeing, and to do those relationships, and to use psychological distance. So all the things that we're using as humans, the AI actually is doing with vision. And if you use things like, for example, LiDAR and all these other sensors, you're kind of losing that ability, or in other words, you're not forced to actually develop that ability. So I guess my conclusion here is that vision only has a lot more to it than just cost saving. It actually puts you in the position of evolution to do exactly what evolution did, which is develop a logic or an idea or a workflow of thinking that leads towards much better intelligence, at least when it comes to interacting with reality. And that's what evolution did with vision. Why didn't evolution come up with LiDAR? Why didn't evolution come up with radar? I mean, it did. Like, for example, bats have a radar, but most developed, particularly more developed creatures have vision. And why is vision related to more developed creatures? Because those creatures have used vision to build a modeling system that deals with things like psychological distance, for example, that interprets shapes, that builds these fundamental shapes like circle, and then is able to derive, okay, an ellipse is closer to a circle than, let's say, to a square, so I can make certain assumptions about its shape, its behavior. And I think one really important thing that is also something that I intuitively always feel when I drive, let's say, my Tesla, and that is that it seems to me that distance and distances, Euclidian distances, psychological distances, no matter how you call them, the concept of distance and the concept of shapes is the Platonic representation of reality and are the building blocks of intelligence, at least of real world intelligence. Probably you could generalize this, but let's stick with the real world. And this goes back to 2024 CVPR. I have a conversation with a researcher from Google DeepMind, and I ask him, why do you think transfer learning between self-driving and robotics makes sense? He said, because it seems like fundamentally the problem is navigation. And I think that these concepts are starting to make sense to me. Like, navigation is obviously a distance problem. It's a shape problem. Robotics is a shape problem, distance problem. Real-world AI is about shapes and distances. Different distances, not just Euclidean geometry. For example, psychological difference, right? A circle is similar to ellipse. Now, an ellipse is also similar to a circle, but we humans tend not to think like that. Maybe a machine will. Depends on how much data we use. Of course, there's the bitter lesson always. The more data we have and the more general the models, the more we can learn. I think this leads us back to the point, okay, but what kind of data do we feed the model? And it seems that vision, which captures colors, distances, shapes, and also has implicit interpretations. This is what vision does. It implicitly interprets things. So it doesn't call something tree, but it knows that a tree is different than a road. And it has a sense, particularly if it's trained on the bitter lesson concept, that a tree, meaning it has seen a lot of data and therefore puts a lot of events in distribution, that a tree is not going to drive on the road, but the car is going to drive on the road and not on the tree and things like that. So it doesn't know what these things are, but it classifies them. And this gets me to another really important revelation from the book, and that's a researcher. I'm not good with the names, and that's fine. Check the book, read the book for yourself. But there's a researcher, she did research in Papua New Guinea. She ended up being a professor at Berkeley, and she found this really interesting takeaway, that is that people in Papua New Guinea kind of memorize colors very similarly to the way we English-speaking people do it, even though we use different languages. So when you're given certain words, you can then memorize colors easier, which led her to interpret the fact that it seems like our perception is fundamentally driving the way we categorize things. It's not the other way around. It's not like we have categories that we made up somehow philosophically, a la Wittgenstein, and then we map that into our perception. It's our perception defines our categories. And also our perception, which is driven by distances, let's say use the concept of psychological distance, and we have certain things that we find similar to others. And all of these intricacies and biases that we develop through vision are part of our intelligence, our real world intelligence. And this leads me to conclude that real world intelligence is going to be driven much, much better with vision only, because vision only not just has it been the main sensor in evolution, but it also allows for an interpretation of what you see in a much more subtle way and a much more more effective way than if we have other modalities. So in other words, it could be, this is a conjecture, that if we constrain ourselves with the sensor suite for real world AI, that we actually get better results.